You have never seen the world as it actually is. You have only ever seen it through a lens built from everything that has happened to you, everything you were taught to believe, and everything you learned to expect. That lens is so familiar, so constant, so invisible, that it does not feel like a lens at all. It feels like reality. And that is exactly the problem. Perspective is not something you choose in the morning like a coat. It is something that was assembled over years, mostly without your awareness, from the materials your life happened to provide. Your earliest experiences, your family, your culture, your language, your fears, your losses, your small daily attention habits. All of these shaped the filter through which every new experience now passes. And that filter determines far more than you probably realize. It determines what you notice and what you overlook. It determines which explanations feel true and which feel impossible. It determines the stories you tell about yourself, about other people, and about what is likely to happen next. The question is not whether you have a perspective. You do. Everyone does. The question is whether the one you are carrying is still serving you, or whether it is quietly working against you. Psychologists use the term schema to describe the mental frameworks you use to organize and interpret experience. These frameworks form early. A child who grows up in an unpredictable environment learns to scan for threat. A child who is consistently encouraged develops a framework in which effort is likely to produce results. A child who is regularly dismissed learns that expressing needs is dangerous. These frameworks are not chosen. They are built by repetition, by emotional intensity, and by the conclusions a young mind draws from its limited but very real experience of the world. The extraordinary thing is that once these schemas are in place, they do not simply sit there waiting to be used. They actively search for confirmation. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, the well-documented tendency to notice, remember, and give weight to information that supports what you already believe, while filtering out or minimizing evidence that contradicts it. If you believe you are fundamentally unlucky, you will notice every setback and forget most of the moments that went your way. If you believe that people cannot be trusted, you will interpret ambiguous behavior as betrayal and dismiss warmth as manipulation. The lens does not simply color experience, it selects it. This is not a character flaw. It is how an information processing system manages an overwhelmingly complex world. Your brain receives an enormous amount of sensory data every second, and it cannot consciously process all of it. So it uses existing frameworks to filter what reaches awareness. The problem is not that this happens. The problem is that it happens automatically, beneath conscious attention, and that the frameworks doing the filtering were built during periods of your life when you had far less understanding, far less choice, and far less context than you do now. The Stoic philosophers understood something about this long before modern psychology had the language to describe it. Epictetus, writing in the 1st century, observed that people are not disturbed by events themselves, but by their judgments about events. Marcus Aurelius, working through the same tradition, wrote that the mind gives character to its own thoughts, meaning that the quality of your inner life depends not on what happens to you, but on how you interpret what happens to you. This was not naive optimism. These were men who had experienced genuine hardship. Epictetus had been enslaved. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire in near constant crisis. Their insight was grounded in practice, not theory. They were pointing at something real, that between the event and your response to it, there is a gap, and in that gap lives your perspective. The cognitive tradition in psychology formalized this insight in the 20th century. Aaron Beck, working with patients experiencing depression, noticed that their suffering was maintained not simply by their circumstances, but by persistent patterns of thought, what he called cognitive distortions. Catastrophizing, where difficulty becomes a catastrophe. All or nothing thinking, where anything short of perfection is experienced as failure. Personalization, where events that have nothing to do with you become evidence about your worth. These distortions are not rare. Research suggests they appear in most people to varying degrees, and they are particularly active during periods of stress, low mood, or uncertainty. What Beck noticed, and what decades of subsequent research have broadly supported, is that these patterns of thought can be identified, examined, and changed. Not easily, not all at once, but genuinely and measurably changed. This brings us to the tools. The first, and perhaps most fundamental tool, is named attention. Not in the vague self-help sense of paying attention, but in the precise sense of deliberately directing where your mind goes and what it dwells on. Neuroscientist Michael Merzenich and others working in the field of neuroplasticity have shown that the brain physically reorganizes itself around patterns of use. Neural pathways that are used frequently become stronger and faster. Those that are neglected weaken over time. This means that what you attend to repeatedly and consistently is not merely a reflection of who you are, it is part of what you are becoming. If you spend years practicing catastrophic thinking, you become more efficient at it. If you begin deliberately redirecting attention toward what is going well, what is uncertain rather than certainly bad, and what options remain available, the brain gradually builds new pathways for that kind of processing. This is not positive thinking. It is directed attention applied consistently over time. The second tool is cognitive reframing, the deliberate practice of examining an interpretation and asking whether it is the only one available. When something difficult happens, the mind typically settles on its first available explanation, the one most consistent with existing schemas. Reframing does not ask you to pretend the difficulty is not real. It asks a simpler question. Is this interpretation the only possible one? A colleague who did not reply to your message could be dismissing you, or could be overwhelmed, or could simply have missed it. A rejection could confirm that you are not good enough, or could be a mismatch, or could be one data point in a longer story that has not finished yet. Reframing does not manufacture false comfort. It expands the range of available interpretations so that the automatic one is no longer the only one. The third tool is perspective taking, the disciplined practice of genuinely inhabiting a viewpoint other than your own. Research by psychologists, including Adam Galinsky, has shown that actively imagining another person's experience, not merely acknowledging that it exists, but genuinely attempting to see from inside it, reduces bias, improves decision-making, and produces measurable changes in attitude and behavior. The mechanism is straightforward. Your current perspective feels inevitable because it is all you have consistently experienced. Encountering a genuinely different perspective, not as an abstraction, but as a felt attempt at understanding, temporarily loosens the grip of your own. It reveals that your lens is a lens, not a window. The fourth tool is slower, less dramatic, and possibly the most powerful of all. It is the practice of sitting with uncertainty, of resisting the mind's urge to close down ambiguous situations with quick, familiar conclusions. The mind finds uncertainty deeply uncomfortable. It tends to resolve ambiguity by reaching for the nearest available explanation, which is usually the most habitual one. Developing the capacity to tolerate uncertainty, to hold a situation open longer before deciding what it means, creates space for perspectives that the automatic mind would never reach. Mindfulness practice, in its secular form, is largely training in exactly this. Not the absence of thought,
but the ability to observe thoughts arising without immediately acting on them or treating them as facts. None of this is straightforward. Changing perspective is not a single decision. It is more like a long series of small decisions made again and again to examine rather than accept the automatic interpretation. There will be days when the old lens reasserts itself completely. There will be situations so emotionally charged that the usual frameworks take over before you have time to notice. This is expected. The philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer wrote that understanding is always a fusion of horizons, that we come to see differently, not by abandoning where we came from, but by allowing our existing horizon to be expanded by contact with something genuinely outside it. Change of perspective is not erasure, it is expansion. The lens through which you see yourself is particularly resistant to examination. Because it is the thing doing the examining, noticing the assumptions you carry about your own worth, your own capacity, and your own story requires a kind of double attention, watching the watcher. This is uncomfortable work, but it is also where perspective change has its most consequential effects. Because if the story you carry about who you are is distorted, if it was built during difficult years from incomplete evidence and the conclusions a younger, less resourced version of you could manage at the time, then almost everything downstream of that story is being shaped by it. Your relationships, your ambitions, your own self-imposed limits, your interpretation of how others see you. You were handed a lens before you knew what a lens was. You did not choose it, you could not have, but you are not obligated to keep using it unchanged for the rest of your life. The world you see is not simply the world. It is the world as filtered through everything that has made you who you are. And the most important question you can ask, not once, but regularly as a practice rather than a project, is whether the lens you're looking through is showing you what is actually there, or only what you have always expected to find.